Now comes the round table. Looking around the room and the round table here, and as the moderator, chair of this session, and with Professor Clark looming large in the background there, I have to say, maybe I can be a student for a change. I'm confused because I hear lots of different explanations for what happened in the Taiwanese election. I'm not sure we have forged a consensus here, and I would like to bring Professor Akinback into the discussion because he seemed to indicate that Hong Kong was not necessarily the driving factor in this election. I did hear a lot about the importance of cross-strait relations. I heard that the status quo is important. I heard someone say just now cross-strait relations are not the only factor, important factor. Then I heard things about age. I heard things about identity. I heard things about neighbors. And I have to say that Britain voted to leave the European Union. That's true. I think if Taiwan voted to leave China, it probably would have a very, very different outcome, I suspect. So I don't think we can push the EU-Britain relationship, the comparison too far. So there's a lot of things on this table here, and I don't know if we can sort this all out in the round table, but I think rather than going back to the panel, what we should do now is open it up for discussion. I see Dr. Ho shaking his head over there on the sideline. So I would ask the audience, you of the round table, to be exceptionally disciplined. I always like to say, if you have a speech, please don't make your speech. We want a question, and questions end with a question mark. So we can come quickly back to the panel. I think we will take a series of questions. So we can start with this gentleman over here, then here. Make sure you raise your hand so I can get to the list.
I just have a question. I don't know if you've looked at it, but when elections happen in Taiwan, what signals does China send to Taiwan? So how does the government talk to its own people, or does the government make any statements, or is there any information you have in regards to the Chinese government interfere in any way in Taiwan elections?
Let's take a series of questions and we'll come back to the audience. I think this gentleman here, waiting for other hands to go up.
Who's the second?
This gentleman right here.
My question is Thesis Gate. Does anyone knows about the infamous Thesis Gate in Taiwan about President Tsai, her doctoral thesis, and also her PhD degree that she claimed that she had from London University Economic University. Does anybody know anything about that one? I'm just curious. You talked about elections, but what about the Thesis Gate that's been going on in Taiwan on YouTube for the last 6 months?
That was a question I did not anticipate. Yes.
I like to listen to all the panelists, from the perspective from the United States, position-wise. Do you think President Trump, his administration overall viewing China is a potential competition, therefore he is conveniently pick up Taiwan's interest in his play along the across trade relationship wise. I think I'd like to see your position, whether that's something, I think whether it's KMT or DPP or Taiwan's people, they need to recognize, is this something just President Trump's his overall is U.S.-centered demographic policy.
Okay, I think we got it. Any one more question, maybe? This gentleman here, and then we'll come back to the panel right here.
I raised this question before. I was wondering how come no panel wants really question about the election fraud in Taiwan, because there are so many evidence showing even on the YouTube right now.
Well, I think that's a pretty full plate, and I don't know who would like to start answering the questions. I know you've all been making notes. Should we just go here and down? Let's start here and then we'll work our way down. And at the end, we'll pass the microphone to Professor Aiken of it.
Okay, I'm gonna take the hard heat on this. Inconvenient truths, I keep saying this. Inconvenient truths, that's important. You have to recognize what's the reality. The thesis, the Tsai Ing-wen's dissertation, or the election fraud. First of all, election fraud, which means a lot of KMT supporters argue it's fraud. But face the reality, think about this. 2.6 million people. If you are saying this is not the real election, you are arguing 2.6 million votes Tsai Ing-wen gain is unreal. Let's think about this. Taiwan is democracy. It doesn't really matter if you like Han Kuo-yu, support KMT, support Republic of China or not. If you really believe in the Republic of China, then you have to believe the Republic of China is a democracy. That's the first thing. A lot of YouTube, I know, I watch all of them. I think Guo Ziqiang, he also do a serious study on this. We do a lot of research. A lot of people hope this is the truth, but unfortunately, from a scholar's perspective, those YouTube videos are not for real. So I take this very seriously. As I said, I challenge this. I said, why we have to be rational? Because if you are a KMT supporter, maybe some of you, maybe you are a DPP supporter, you have to be realized something that you believe, I believe, you believe, you know, I know, but they don't. The moderate, the medium voters, they don't. The point is not about you believing this. The point is whether you can convince others with different opinion to vote for you next time. So if you stick with this dissertation, stick with the election fraud, you never win. Right? Yes. So I guess I'm very serious about this because I know the whole thing, and Taiwan need to move on. Taiwan need to move on, including Republic of China, Taiwan, blue, green, not red, sorry. Blue and green. So, one thing, well, Taiwan is a democracy, Republic of China is a democracy. If you look forward, you have to think for in the future, 2020, election cycle is not too far, it's not long. 2022, we have a candidate. 2024, we have a presidential election. We means Taiwan. I mean, the we means blue-green. The we means KMT-DPP. If you support Taiwan, support Republic of China, you have to think Taiwan is democracy. You have to believe this first, and then continue to move on. I know, you feel better if you talk to the like-minded mind. If you talk to your own bubble, you feel really pumped. Yes, that's a fraud. Yes, the dissertation is fake. Does that help?
I think you have a career. You have a career as a politician.
I thought he was going to end that with, and today I'm glad to announce my candidacy. You better be careful. So, just voter fraud or things like that. Taiwan, leading into its election day, probably has one of the highest concentrations of foreign press and election observers that you will ever. You can't walk down the street and not trip over some foreigner who's there to observe Taiwan's elections. And so it's probably one of the most open, accessible, watched electoral processes you'll ever find. The way the votes are counted, the way that you have neighborhood observer teams in the ballot stations, and man, these guys are watching. right? If somebody stumbles or they slur a name or they don't pronounce someone, everybody stops and you back up, you do it again. And so also the thesis stuff, I mean, yeah.
I'm sorry, that's not the case though.
Well, that's what I'll say this.
Because I have personal seen it.
And I have observed the opposite. The signaling. I bet one of these guys will talk about the signaling from China. There's also important signaling from the United States. Right? The U.S. tries to go out of its way to not have an obvious dog in that race, horse in that race, dog in that hunt. But what has traditionally happened prior to the election is not the incumbent, but the challenger has made a visit to D.C., the halls of Congress, talking to folks in the administration, all very quiet, and everybody signals to each other where they're at, their rhetoric, and they get a good feel for moving on. The KMT didn't do that this year. The KMT candidate didn't do that this year. And so that was observed. Trump support for Taiwan. If I'm going to be pessimistic, some might say realistic, Trump is a transactional leader, right? Everybody's very worried. There's a common saying in international relations. There are no permanent friends in interstate relations, only common interests. And so whether it's a Democrat or a Republican president in the United States, the American support for Taiwan often hinges on what those interests are and when they converge. Look at Obama very much pivoted away from Taiwan during his first term in office and learned very quickly after a diplomatic kind of ruse that he was switched back. So this notion of permanent friendships and love, undying love for each other, I mean, that's only in marriage, hopefully.
Yeah, when Professor Stockton spoke, I just kept writing down dollar signs.
All right, I think most of the big element has been answered, but I'll just add on a couple of notes. So, I think election fraud, I mean, when you're trying to make an argument that he actually has at least 10% of the turnout rate that's being boosted by, I don't know, electronic or just some type of artificial entering into the system, given the fact that there are bipartisan observers in the electoral center, and there are foreign observers plus foreign media. Everybody's overseeing what's actually going on. We see the call from each ballot and tabulating those votes on the panel. It's actually quite difficult to actually play the game. I mean, especially Taiwan doesn't really use whole electronic voting system. So we're actually, reading out who gets able, which party get able, which candidate get able, each time when we are showcasing that. So it's just, I mean, it's hard to make this argument nowadays. And on the second thought, I mean, in terms of, it's kind of related, in terms of the Tsai's thesis gate, this is kind of interesting because I'm hearing this story not from independent, not from like this light DPTV supporter or light KMT supporter, but from deep KMT and deep Green supporter, where they actually ally together and say, well, Tsai doesn't have a PhD. Tsai's thesis is a fake, and she was never awarded a PhD. So, what's next? The question is, what next? So you're going to challenge Tsai for her integrity, not being a scholar, and at the same time, you're also challenging the official notice that's issued by London School of Economics and Political Science, and also the Ministry of Education in Taiwan, because, I mean, I've never been hired in Taiwan, of course, but for all my friends who actually got a PhD in the state, coming back to Taiwan to be a faculty member, their thesis or their dissertation or their degree has to be certified by Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So if the whole process are fake, then I mean it's more or less like belief, not really a factual kind of debate. So and in terms of what Trump is playing Taiwan as a card against China, I think what's interesting now is even though this anti-Chinese rhetoric is starting in about the late 2016, especially starting kind of spiraling up in about 2018, but we do see a bipartisan consensus against China, and this bipartisan consensus is not because of their traditional partisan ally or issue position. It's about power competition. It's about the hegemony competition between China and Taiwan. Sorry, China and the United States. So it's hard to actually just think about Taiwan as being a card to be played, but more or less, it's certainly a good showcase tool to China. All right, thank you.
Yeah, let's hear from the councilman, and we're going to go to Professor Baker.
First, I'm the former spokesperson of KMT government. So it's really, I don't want to be Tsai Ing-wen's spokesperson. But I must say, during my visit to the United States, I already visited for 9 cities and held the speech. And every speech, audience will raise the same question about election form. It's very complicated to explain what happened in the election. So especially it's hard for speak in English. So I think the people, if you are very care about this issue, maybe you can participate in the tomorrow's speech. I will tell the detail. And I think mainland China will respond to the election is also the decline, the anti-independent, Taiwan independence, and insist the 92 consensus. It's not directly to response for Taiwan election. Yeah.
We're going to have a simultaneous translation tomorrow for this. Professor Aiken, then I want to go back to Professor Clark before we end. But Professor Aiken.
I'll just say briefly that I think Taiwan has a stake in bipartisan American support. And one of the challenges that it faces right now is the Trump administration's actions that are that lean very far toward Taiwan and therefore sound very appealing to Taiwan people, and they're likely to be enthusiastic about Trump for exactly that reason. I think that is not necessarily a safe strategy for Taiwan. There is an American consensus about essentially bipartisan about how to manage our relationship with Taiwan. Trump has violated that, and it's very likely that when he is out of office, whether that's 4 years from now or next year, that we will go back to the way we were doing things before. And being tied to what will, I think, be a discredited foreign policy position on his part is dangerous for Taiwan. So I think it's important to be cautious about how much Taiwan wants to tie itself to his tail. And in terms of the remark that Hans made about the permanency of marriages, you can look at Trump and see just how that works out.
No better friend, I'm sure. And I know we're almost out of time, and I'm happy to pass the microphone back to Dr. Ho. But I wanted to make sure that Professor Clark, Harold, are you still there? Yeah. We may have to turn up the sound a little bit. Professor Clark, do you have any final thoughts for us here?
Well, I would simply reiterate the point that Chris was making in his address, is that we have to be very careful making what social scientists call cross-level inferences, and that we'll know a lot more about what drove voting behavior and perhaps determine the outcome of the 2020 election once we have high-quality survey data from TDS. Right now we don't have that, and so we must exercise considerable caution. And so I'd leave it at that, we have to be careful at this particular juncture in terms of trying to make inferences, perhaps particularly about the influence of the events in Hong Kong on the Taiwan election. And so, you know, as scholars in the group, I would just say be careful for now.
Okay, we have to wait on the data, according to Professor Clark, and that might take a while, and we have to wait on Councilman Lowe's speech tomorrow. So we have to wait. We're not quite ready to draw any conclusions, but I'm sure that Professor Ho will give us a few final remarks that will straighten everything out.
Thank you. Excellent panel. Thank you for thank Dr. Holyfield for doing an excellent job. I think I'll only spend a couple of minutes before I pass the mic to Grace, and who's in charge of the ceremony. And I want to really say thank you to Director General Peter Chen. And he's so busy, and now he's still spend half the day with us. And also Philip Shi and Director Shi also. Thank you for before I forget, I want to also thank Professor Phil Paulino and Professor of University of Texas. I should give you an hour for a speech. Thank you for joining us, Professor Paulino. And I think in order to thank, we have Professor Kim of the school too, and he just finished his class. He's supporting us, and he will join us tonight. And I think I would thank the Taiwan Student Association tonight, and these are the really heavily lifters, and I do not do much. They do most of the work and the hard work. Thank you. Can I give President of the TSA? This is amazing. This is outstanding young man for doing all this work. Can I use 30 more seconds to advertise my students and my graduate students, my students at EPPS? Can we all rise? You all rise? Let the audience recognize you. My PhD student Tyler, and Proma, and Carlos, and Selma. But of course, I cannot miss one person. Furkan. And where's the Blake? Blake is doing all the work. Then I want to request that Thank you.
This has been such an awesome conference. Just one last announcement. There is going to be a class in here pretty soon. And so I'd love to invite you all to continue your discussions outside of the